They cut the cake, and then Sharon read a deed that handed Mom's $480,000 house to herself and slid an eviction notice across the table to me, the one who'd nursed Mom for 9 years. How do you lose a house you've lived in and cared for every single day for 9 years, in the time it takes to blow out 80 candles? I didn't raise my voice. I didn't beg. I folded that notice in half and handed it to the man everyone called the cranky judge next door. None of them ever asked why a nurse like me had stayed so quiet. They thought the quiet was weakness. They thought a woman who didn't shout at her own mother's birthday party had simply run out of fight. What they were looking at was a nurse standing very still, the way I'd stood still in 100 rooms before, while my hands did the counting my mouth wasn't doing yet. 9 years had taught me that the loudest person in a room is almost never the one holding the truth. The truth sits in paperwork. It sits in a date. It sits in a number written down, night after night, in a hand nobody else thought to check. And whether that number still matches what really happened. I was holding one thing they'd all forgotten to count, and they were about to learn what a nurse does with a number that doesn't add up. But let me set the table the way it was actually set that afternoon, before any of them touched a knife to that cake. The house was on Hartley Lane, in Millbrook, Ohio, a 2-story with a wraparound porch my father had painted gray the summer before he died, and Mom had never let anyone repaint it since. Eleanor Kessler, 80 years old that day. The good plates were out, the ones with the thin gold rim that only came down for funerals and Christmases, and I had washed every one by hand that morning while the ginger tea steeped. Every morning for 9 years I made my mother a cup of ginger tea. I'd cut a coin of fresh ginger, drop it in the pot, and carry it to the little table by the kitchen window where the light came in best, setting it beside the blister pack and the dose log. The right tablets, in the right order, at the right hour. The tea first, because she liked to hold something warm while she took them. Then I'd write the time in the log in my own hand, the habit of a woman taught that if it isn't written down, it didn't happen. Tea, tablets, time, in that order, every single morning. I never thought of it as devotion. It was just the shape of my days. You don't notice the shape of your own days until somebody tries to take it from you. I'm a nurse. I want that on the table early, because almost no one in my family ever said it out loud without making it sound smaller than it was. For 11 years before I came home, I worked the inpatient floors at a hospital 2 counties over. Nights, mostly. The shifts where you learn to read a chart faster than you can read a face. I was good at the part no one thanks you for. The counting, the second look at a number that doesn't sit right. A count that's off by 3 is not an accident you forgive. It's a question you ask until somebody answers it. 9 years ago, I gave that up. Mom had started forgetting the small things first, where she'd set her glasses, whether she'd fed the cat, the name of the street she'd lived on for 40 years. The doctors gave it a name I won't keep repeating, because my mother was more than a name on a chart. I'll only say this much, and then I'll let her keep her dignity the way she kept it her whole life. There was a medication that helped her hold the thread of herself. Her evening dose, the small white tablets, taken right on time, she stayed Eleanor. She knew my voice. She knew the porch was gray. She knew, on a good morning, exactly who had wronged her and exactly who had not. The right dose, on time, keeps a memory standing. I'd find out later, the hard way, just how much rode on that one quiet sentence, and how far someone would go once they understood it too. So I came home, I let my badge expire and traded the night floors for one patient, the most important one. I told myself it was temporary the way you tell yourself anything is temporary when you're 46 and your mother needs you. It was 9 years. 9 years of tea and tablets and the time written in the log. 9 years of driving her to the clinic in Carlton County, of reading her chart over the nurse's shoulder because a chart is a sentence I can't leave unread. 9 years of sleeping across the hall with the door open so I'd hear her if she got up in the night. I won't pretend it was all warmth. There were mornings she didn't want the tablets and I had to coax them, mornings she called me by a dead sister's name I never had, and I learned not to correct her, because a frightened patient is a patient you've failed. There were nights I sat on the bathroom floor at 2 a.m, too tired to cry, but here is the thing the family never understood, the thing Sharon in particular could not afford to understand. I was good at it, not noble. Good. I kept her clean and fed and her dose exact, and the proof sat in a kitchen cabinet, a calendar and a log, every box checked, every time written, 9 years of a nurse refusing to let a single detail go unrecorded. I didn't know, building that record, that I was building the one thing that would save us. The habit of writing it down would turn out to be the difference between a story I could prove and a story they could bury. And one more thing about the chart, because it matters more than anything else I'll tell you here. Somewhere in those 9 years, on one of those gray plastic clinic chairs, a doctor wrote an assessment, a date, and a finding, in the hedged language doctors use when they have to put a hard thing on paper, that as of that day, my mother could no longer be relied upon to understand and execute decisions of consequence. I'd read it over the nurse's shoulder and filed it where I file everything, in the part of my mind that keeps numbers. I had no idea I was reading a knife. It would be years before I understood that a date like that is a wall. Anything signed before it stands, anything signed after it, does not. I carried that wall around in my head, unknowing, the whole time. And then Sharon read a date out loud over a birthday cake, and the wall and the date touched, and I went cold. My brother and sister did not do these things. Let me be precise about what they did do. Greg, my middle brother, came by on holidays and fixed the gutter once. Sharon, my older sister, the first of us, came by less. Sharon was the one framed on the mantel in her cap and gown, the one whose name our mother used to say with a softness she never quite managed for mine. For as long as I'd been alive, Sharon was the one we were all quietly arranging ourselves around. I say it because it matters later. The way the shape of a room matters when you're trying to understand how a thing could happen in it, and no one moved to stop it. Somewhere in those 9 years, my mother and I did a thing I barely thought about at the time. I think about it constantly now. It was maybe 2 years in. Mom was still herself most days, sharp, dry, a woman who'd run the front office of a school for 30 years and missed nothing. She got it into her head, after a bad afternoon at the clinic, that she wanted to put things straight while she could still put them anywhere at all. Those were her words. She just said one Thursday that she'd asked the lawyer next door to come over and that I was to make tea for 3. The lawyer next door wasn't exactly next door. The man next door was Walter Brennan, and the family had a name for him I'd grown up hearing, the cranky judge next door. He'd been a probate judge in Carleton County for 30 years before he retired, and to my brother and sister he was a porch light that came on too early, and a voice that complained about cars in his drive. To my mother, he was a man who'd sat on that bench for 3 decades and watched families do terrible things to the estates of people who could no longer defend themselves. She trusted him the way you trust a man who has already seen the worst version of your situation and is not surprised by it. So I made tea for 3, ginger, of course, and Judge Brennan sat at the kitchen table with my mother and a woman I'd never met, a lawyer named Ruth, and they talked in low voices over papers I wasn't asked to read. I poured, I refilled, I went back to the laundry. I assumed it was a will, the ordinary kind. Mom signed something. Judge Brennan signed as a witness. I remember his hand was steady, steadier than mine would have been. Ms. Okafor put the papers in a flat leather folder and took them when she left. "It's handled," Mom told me that night, patting the back of my hand the way she used to when I was small. "You don't worry about the house. The house knows whose it is." I thought it was just a thing old people say. I didn't ask. That's the part I'd take back if I could take back any of it, not what was in those papers, because I'd find out years later that what was in them was the only reason I'm telling you this from a place of standing instead of ruin. I'd take back the not asking, because the not asking is why I spent the worst afternoon of my life thinking I'd already lost. Now, the party. Sharon planned it, which should have been my first warning because Sharon hadn't planned anything for our mother in a decade. She called me 3 weeks out, bright and busy. 80 was a milestone, the whole family should come, she'd handle the catering and the photographer, and I should just do what you do, keep Mom comfortable. She said it the way you'd tell a hired aide to keep the patient comfortable. I noticed it, and I let it go, because letting things go had become a muscle I no longer had to think about using. There was a photographer. There was a video camera on a tripod in the corner of the dining room, a nephew of Greg's running it. capturing everything, and I want you to hold on to that camera because cameras don't take sides, and that one was running the whole time. There were folding chairs from the church and a cake from the good bakery, 3 layers, 80 candles they didn't light because somebody said it was a fire hazard and everybody laughed. There were cousins I hadn't seen in years. There was Patty Doyle, a cousin on my mother's side, who hugged me a little too long in the kitchen, looked at me a little too carefully and said, "You've carried a lot, Rachel," in a voice I'd only understand much later. And at the center of it, my mother in her good blue dress, smaller than she used to be, holding a warm cup because she liked to hold something warm. She was having a good day, I want to say that clearly. The morning had gone right, the tea, the dose, the time written in the log, and she knew the cousins' names, and she laughed at the right places, and when the cake came out, she said, "Don't you dare let them light 80 of those." And the whole room loved her for it. She was Eleanor. She was herself. I have held on to that because of what came after, and because of what I'd later learned somebody had tried to do to make sure she wasn't. They cut the cake. Greg's nephew swung the camera around, and Sharon stood up at the head of the table, tapped a fork against a water glass, and said she had a little announcement, a family matter, best done while we're all together. She had a folder with her. A flat one. Not leather, a cheap plastic one from an office supply store. And I noticed that too, the way you notice a wrong number on a chart before you even know what it means.
As most of you know, Mom's not able to manage things the way she used to. We've all watched it happen, and the responsible thing, the loving thing, is to make sure the house, the biggest thing she has, is in hands that can actually take care of it, the grown-up side of it.
She said it in the calm, carrying voice she used for rooms she intended to run. Then she opened the plastic folder.
Mom signed a deed, transferring the house on Hartley Lane to me, so that it's protected. So there's no question, no fighting, no mess later. It's done, it's recorded, and I wanted you all to hear it from me today with Mom right here, so nobody can say it happened in a corner.
And then she read it out. The legal description of the property, the address I'd swept the porch of that morning, the figure, $480,000, said out loud over the cake like a number at an auction, and a date. She read the date the deed had been signed. While the rest of the room was doing the arithmetic of shock, Sharon owns the house now, is that allowed? Somebody should say something. My mind did the only arithmetic it knew. It heard a date, and laid it down next to another date, the way I'd laid 1,000 numbers down next to each other on 1,000 night shifts. The date Sharon read out, and the date in my mother's chart, the date a doctor in Carlton County had written the assessment that said, in the careful language of medicine, that Eleanor Kessler could no longer reliably understand and execute decisions of consequence. The deed was signed after that date. I didn't say it. In that first moment, I didn't trust my own count, and a good nurse never acts on the first count. She counts again. So I sat there with 2 dates touching in my head and my hands flat on my knees, and the room read my silence as defeat. I could see the cousins look at me and then look away, the way people look away from someone who's just been beaten in front of them and is choosing not to make a scene. And then Sharon slid the second piece of paper across the table. It came to a stop against the edge of my plate, beside a smear of buttercream. An eviction notice, a real one, on real letterhead, naming me, Rachel M. Kessler, as an occupant of a property now owned by Sharon Kessler Vance, giving me 30 days to vacate, 30 days to leave the house where I slept across the hall from my mother with the door open. She'd had it drawn up, she'd had it ready. She had brought it to our mother's 80th birthday in a plastic folder and waited until the cake was cut to put it next to my fork. The room went quiet in the particular way a room goes quiet when everyone is waiting to see if you'll scream. I didn't scream. I read it the way I read everything, all the way to the bottom, including the part nobody reads. And then I folded it in half, and again into a neat small square, and held it in my hand. My mother, at the head of the table, was looking at me with an expression I couldn't fully name. Not confusion exactly, something underneath it. She opened her mouth like she might say something. Sharon put a hand on her arm. "It's all right, Mom. We talked about this. You don't need to worry about it." That was the moment something in me went very cold and very clear. Not the deed, not the eviction. The hand on my mother's arm and the words, "We talked about this," said to a woman who, I happened to know, had no memory of any such talk, because I was the one who knew, hour by hour, what my mother could and couldn't hold. I stood up, quietly. I want to tell you I had a plan, but I didn't. Not yet. I only had a count that hadn't been confirmed and a folded square of paper and an unbearable need to put it somewhere safe before I did anything I couldn't undo. So I walked out the front door, across the porch my father had painted gray, down the steps, across the strip of grass, and I knocked on the door of the cranky judge next door. Walter Brennan opened it in his cardigan with a crossword folded under his arm, and he took one look at my face, then at the square of paper I held out, and he didn't say anything cranky at all. He unfolded the notice. He read it the way I had, all the way to the bottom, and then he looked up and asked one question, in a flat, dry voice that had once run a courtroom. "What's the date on the deed she just read?" I told him. He nodded once, slowly, the way you nod when a number you suspected turns out to be exactly the number you suspected, and he said, "Come inside, Rachel. Leave the door open so you can see your mother's window. There are some things I think it's time you knew. But before I tell you what was inside that house, I need to go back into the dining room I'd just walked out of, because while I was on a neighbor's porch, the people I'd just left were deciding who I was, and they decided fast." Here is what I learned later, partly from Patty Doyle and partly from a video file Greg's nephew never thought to delete. The second I was out the door, Sharon turned the room. She did it gently, which is the part I can't forgive. She didn't rage. She lowered her voice into something warm and tired and sad, the voice of a woman carrying a heavy thing, and said the kind of sentences that don't sound like knives until you feel where they've gone in. "I didn't want to do it like this," she said. "I really didn't. But you've all seen how she's been. Rachel, she's burned out. 9 years, no job, no life of her own, just this house and Mom. You saw her just now, she couldn't even speak. She's not stable. I've been worried about her for a long time. And here is the second knife, and it came from a second hand." Greg cleared his throat and backed her up. My brother, who had fixed the gutter once, he said in the reasonable voice of a reasonable man, "It's true, I've seen it. She's gotten possessive. About Mom, about the house. Sharon's right that somebody had to step in before this got worse." He said it to the cousins. He said it to the camera he'd forgotten was running. He gave my exhaustion a shape and handed it to the room as a diagnosis, and the room, because it is so much easier to believe the calm woman with the folder than to imagine what the folder really was, took it. They had built it in advance. The smear wasn't improvised in the heat of the moment. Rachel's jealous, Rachel's burned out, Rachel's not stable. It had been laid down ahead of time, in phone calls I wasn't on, so that when the deed was read and the notice slid across the table, the only person who might object would already be pre-explained, already accounted for. The exhausted one, the unwell one, the one who'd given up 9 years and a career and was therefore, conveniently, the one who looked like she had the most to gain and the least grip on herself. I want to stop here and tell you something about my sister, because if I let you go on thinking she was a cartoon villain in a plastic folder, then I've made it too easy. Sharon was afraid. She had been the one who was supposed to be fine. The first of us, the bright one, with the degree and the husband and the house in a good part of Columbus. Then, across about 6 years, all of it came apart in slow motion. The marriage to Vance went first. She kept the name. I never fully understood why. Then a business she'd put her own money into. Our mother used to worry about her out loud, in the kitchen, over tea. "Your sister's not as steady as she lets on. She's frightened of being poor, even when she had no reason to be." I'd thought it was just a mother fretting. I understand now it was a diagnosis. So when Sharon talked about the house needing hands that can take care of it, the financial side, the grown-up side, I don't think she was lying about what she felt. Frightened people believe the things that serve them. She'd built a whole story in which taking the house was the mature, necessary thing, and the only person it hurt was the sister foolish enough to spend her best years wiping a counter and writing times in a log. To Sharon, the 11 years on hospital floors didn't count because they were over, and the 9 years at home didn't count either because anyone could be there. She had spent so long needing me to be the lesser one that she'd stopped being able to see the part of me that counts things. And a person who can't see the part of you that counts things will, eventually, leave a discrepancy lying around where you can find it. And there was the guilt, because there is always the guilt, and Sharon knew how to use it the way she knew how to use a fork against a glass. Before I'd gone out to the judge's porch, while the eviction notice was still cooling on the table, she leaned toward me, just the two of us inside the noise, and said the thing she'd clearly been saving.
Don't make this ugly. Think about how it looks. You, of all people, fighting Mom on her birthday. After everyone in this family bent over backwards for you your whole life. You were the baby. You got away with everything. And now you want to accuse your own sister over a house? I've been the one handling the real things. The paperwork. The bills. The medical paperwork. All of it. While you played house. Don't you dare make me the bad guy for being the only one willing to do the hard part.
She said it soft, almost kind. It is a remarkable thing what that sentence does. It takes the truth and turns it exactly inside out. She had handled the paperwork, meaning she'd had a deed drawn up. She had done the hard part, meaning she'd timed it for the day a room full of witnesses could be turned against me. And it reaches back to a childhood it says I owe them silence for, because once they were kind to me. I felt the pull of it. For 1 second I almost folded a second time. That's how guilt works. It doesn't argue with your facts. It goes underneath them, to the child you used to be, and asks her to be good. But I wasn't the child anymore, and a nurse handed a sentence like, I handled the medical paperwork, does not feel comforted. She feels a number move. Because I was the one who handled the medical paperwork. Every clinic visit, every chart, every refill of those small white tablets, that was mine, in my hand, in my log. So what paperwork exactly had Sharon been handling? I filed the question away with the 2 dates. There was more here than a deed now. There was a discrepancy. By the time I came back across the grass an hour later, and I did come back because my mother was in that house, the family had turned. The cousins who'd hugged me in the kitchen wouldn't meet my eyes. An aunt I'd loved my whole life put a hand on my shoulder. Sweetheart, maybe you should think about what's best for you now. Sharon can take it from here. Patty Doyle stood by the window with her arms crossed and a look on her face like she was watching something she'd seen before. And Sharon came to me with that warm, sad, terrible voice and said, gently, in front of everyone, Why don't you go pack a bag tonight, Rachel? Stay somewhere. Get some rest. We'll handle Mom. You've done enough. You've done enough. 9 years, folded up like a notice and slid back across the table to me. I looked around that dining room, the gold-rimmed plates I'd washed, the cake, the whole family I'd grown up inside of, every one of them now arranged, the way they'd always arranged themselves, around Sharon. I looked at my mother, tired now. The good day going thin, holding a cup of tea gone cold because I hadn't been there to make her a fresh one. And I understood, standing in the middle of my own family, that I was alone in it. That the truth I was holding, 2 dates touching, account not yet confirmed, was worth nothing in that room, because that room had already decided. They had turned their backs first, all of them, before I'd said a single word in my own defense. So I didn't say it, not there, not to them. You don't announce a count until you've counted again, and you've got it written down in a hand nobody can argue with. I made my mother a fresh cup of ginger tea, and I sat with her by the window until the last of the cousins left, and I said nothing about deeds or dates or the folded square of paper now sitting on the cranky judge's kitchen table next door. But I'll tell you what I was thinking. Somewhere in this house there was a blister pack and a dose log in my own handwriting, and I knew, the way a nurse knows exactly how many small white tablets should be left in that pack on the evening of my mother's 80th birthday. And I was thinking that if my mother had been having good days, sharp days, days where she knew the porch was gray and her own daughter's voice, then I needed to understand how, and when, and at whose hand she had ever had a day bad enough to sign her own house away to someone standing right next to her. If your sister slid an eviction notice across your mother's birthday cake, who would you have handed it to? The man I'd handed mine to was, at that moment, sitting alone at his kitchen table next door with a phone in his hand and a number he hadn't dialed in years, and the deed he'd witnessed 2 years before locked in a flat leather folder the rest of my family didn't know existed. They were about to find out the quiet was never quiet at all. It was counting. And the deed, it would turn out, was the smallest of the things that didn't add up that night. Walter Brennan kept his house the way I imagine he'd kept his courtroom. Nothing on the floor that didn't belong there, every chair square to the table, a single lamp doing the work of 3. He set the folded eviction notice on the kitchen table, smoothed it flat with the side of his hand, and looked at it without reading it again. He'd already read it. He was the kind of man who only read a thing once. "Sit," he said. So I sat. From his kitchen window I could see across the strip of grass to my mother's house, the bright square of the dining room, the cousins still milling, one lit window on the side that was my mother's room. He'd told me to leave his front door open so I could see her window, and I understood now it wasn't sentiment. It was so I'd keep my head. A nurse will hold steady through almost anything if you give her one patient to keep an eye on. "I'm going to ask you the same question again," he said, "and this time answer it slowly, because the whole afternoon turns on it. What is the date on the deed Sharon read out?" I told him. The month, the day, the year, the way she'd said it over the cake in that calm, carrying voice, like a number at an auction. He didn't write it down. He closed his eyes for a second, the way you do when you're laying one thing carefully on top of another inside your own head, and I recognized the gesture because it was mine. When he opened his eyes, he didn't look surprised. He looked the way I imagine he'd looked from a bench for 30 years, watching a thing he'd seen too many times arrive on schedule.
"All right. Now I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to let me get all the way to the end before you feel anything. Can you do that?"
I said I could. Letting a hard thing get all the way to the end before I feel it is most of what my work is.
2 years ago, your mother asked me to witness her signature in her kitchen. You made the tea, Ginger. You poured for 3 and went back to your laundry, and you thought you were watching an old woman finally get around to making a will. It wasn't a will. Or, not only a will. Your mother signed a deed that day, Rachel. A particular kind. She kept the right to live in that house for the rest of her life, the absolute right, the kind no one can sign away over her head. And she put the rest of it, the house itself, after she's gone, where she wanted it to go. The remainder, the law calls it, but it's a plain thing, who gets the house after. She put it with the person who'd be living there, caring for her. She did it while she still could. She told me, in those exact words, that she wanted it handled while she could still put things anywhere at all.
Put things straight while I can still put them anywhere at all. The same words she'd said to me that Thursday, glasses pushed up into her hair. I'd thought it was just a thing old people say. "I witnessed it," he said. "My signature is on it, because your mother wanted a witness whose word would be hard to wave away in a courtroom, and an old probate judge is exactly that. Ruth Okafor drew it. She has the original, locked in her office for 2 years, waiting for the day somebody tried to pretend it didn't exist." He tapped the table once. Today somebody tried. I want to say I felt relief. I didn't, not yet. What I felt was the floor of the afternoon shifting, the way it shifts when a patient you'd written off pulls a number you didn't expect. Not joy, just the cold work of recounting everything you thought you knew. Because if my mother had signed a deed 2 years ago, while she was still sharp, still the woman who ran a school office and missed nothing, Then the deed Sharon read over the cake was not the first deed. It was the second. And the second had been signed on a date I'd just laid down next to a wall in my mother's chart. They thought the deed Sharon read was the last word. It wasn't even the first. "Judge Brennan," I said, and heard my own voice come out flat and careful, the voice I use over a patient when the family is in the room and I don't want them to hear the alarm yet. "The deed Sharon read, the date on it." I gave it to him a second time. "My mother has a finding in her medical chart. A doctor in Carlton County wrote that as of a certain day, she could no longer reliably understand and execute decisions of consequence." I read it over the nurse's shoulder. "I know the date." I stopped. The deed Sharon read was signed after that day. The room was very quiet. Across the grass, my mother's window glowed. He nodded once, slowly, the same nod he'd given on his porch, the nod of a man whose suspicion had just been confirmed by the one person in the family close enough to confirm it. "Then you already understand the thing it took me 30 years on a bench to learn," he said. "A date like that is a wall. It doesn't move. Everything on one side of it stands, because the person who signed knew what they were doing, and everything on the other side." He let it hang. He didn't finish, because he could see I'd finished it for myself a long time ago, in a gray plastic chair reading a sentence I hadn't known was a knife. I made myself sit with the whole shape of it before I let myself move, because a nurse who acts on the first count is a nurse who hangs the wrong bag. 2 deeds, one signed before the wall, with this man's name on it. One signed after the wall, by my mother, somehow, on a day I'd have sworn she could not have understood what she was signing, read out loud over her own birthday cake by the daughter it handed the house to. "There's something wrong with the second one beyond the date," I said. I didn't know yet what it was. I only knew the way you know when a chart doesn't hang together, when the vitals say one thing and the patient says another, and your job is to keep asking until the 2 stories meet. "She has good days. She had a good day today. She knew the cousins' names this afternoon. She told them not to light 80 candles. That's not a woman who can't understand a deed. So how did she have a day, on the day that deed was signed, bad enough to sign it and good enough that nobody in the room thought to stop her?" He looked at me a long moment. "That," he said, "is exactly the right question. And it's not mine to answer. I wasn't in the room, and I won't guess in a way that could hurt you later if I'm wrong. But it's a question about a discrepancy. You're already doing the thing the rest of them think you can't do." He came back from a drawer with a pen and the back of an envelope and wrote a name and a number in a hand steadier than mine. "Ruth Okafor. You go see her. Not Monday. Tomorrow morning. Tell her Walter Brennan sent you, and the day he warned her about has come." He slid the envelope across the table the way Sharon had slid the notice across the other one, and I noticed the difference in my own chest, between a thing pushed at you to take something away and a thing pushed at you to give something back. "One more thing," he said, and his voice dropped into a private weight. "When you go in tomorrow, you're going to want to ask her how to get the house back. Don't. That's the wrong question, and it's the one they're counting on you to ask, because it's the one that loses. Let Ruth tell you the right one." He walked me to the door. Across the grass, the last cars were pulling out of my mother's driveway. "Go make your mother her tea," he said. "Act like a daughter who's been beaten. Let them believe it tonight. You'll have the rest of your life to let them find out otherwise." So that's what I did. I crossed the grass with the envelope folded into my pocket where the eviction notice had been, and I went into my mother's house, the house I'd been given 30 days to leave, and I put the kettle on. I cut a coin of ginger. I made her a fresh cup, because the one in front of her had gone cold an hour ago when I wasn't there to keep it warm, and I sat with her by the window in the emptying house until her good day went all the way thin, and she let me walk her to bed. She held my hand on the stairs. She said, "It's a nice party, isn't it?" And I said, "Yes, Mom. It was a lovely party." And I meant the part of it that was her, in her blue dress, telling a room full of people not to set her on fire. I didn't sleep. I lay in the room across the hall with the door open, the way I had for 9 years, and I counted. Not the tablets, not yet. That would come. And when it came, it would change everything. And some part of me already knew it, and was circling it the way you circle the one number on a chart you're afraid to look at straight. What I counted that night was the dates. 2 deeds, 2 dates, 1 wall between them, and underneath them, a question with no answer. How do you give a woman a bad enough day, on purpose, on schedule, that she'll sign her own house away, and a good enough one a week later that she can host her own birthday and remember every cousin's name? I knew there was an answer, I just didn't want it to be the answer it was. Ruth Okafor's office was on the 2nd floor of a brick building on the square in Millbrook, above a shop that had been 3 different shops in the years I'd been home. The waiting room had 2 chairs and a plant that was real, which I noticed, because I notice whether the plant is real. She came out herself to get me, no assistant, younger than I'd expected and very still, the still of a person who has learned that whoever stays quiet in the room is usually the one holding the truth. "You're Eleanor's daughter," she said. "The nurse." Not a nurse. The nurse. Like it was a position left empty in a file that I'd finally walked in to fill. "Walter called me last night. He said the day had come." She held the door. "Come in and tell me what they did. All of it. Slowly. I'm going to take notes and interrupt you. And when I interrupt, it's because you've said something more important than you realize." So I told her. The cake and the plastic folder. She stopped me on the folder, made me describe it, asked whether the leather one I'd seen 2 years ago and this cheap one could have come from the same office, and when I said no, she wrote a single word and underlined it. The deed Sharon read, the figure said aloud, the date, the eviction notice, the 30 days, the buttercream on the edge of my plate. "We talked about this, Mom," said to a woman who, hour by hour, had no memory of any such talk. And the chart, the wall, the date, the assessment in a Carleton County doctor's hedged, careful hand, and I watched her go still the way I go still when a number finally locks. When I was done, she set her pen down. "I'm going to do something most lawyers won't do in a first meeting," she said. "I'm going to tell you the case you think you have, then why it's the wrong one, then the right one. Walter said you'd come in wanting to know how to get the house back. He told me to stop you before you spent a year and $40,000 asking the question that loses, so let me stop you."
You want to sue your sister for the house. Walk into Carleton County and say, "She took it, it's mine, give it back." Here's what happens. It becomes your word against hers about what your mother wanted, and a jury hears a tired caregiver who feels owed. It becomes a fight about feelings, about who deserves it. And feelings are the ground your sister has chosen, because she spent months seeding a story that you're the unstable one, the jealous one who clung to your mother and the house because you had nothing else. You'd be walking onto the field she built. You might be right and still lose. Deserving is a swamp. Don't go in there.
She leaned back. "Then what?" I said.
Then you don't ask for the house at all. You don't ask for anything that requires anyone to believe you about what was in your mother's heart. You make this about 2 pieces of paper and a date, and you let the paper do what you've spent 9 years letting paper do. First piece of paper. The deed Sharon recorded. We don't argue it's unfair. We don't argue you deserve the house more. We argue one cold thing. On the date it was signed, your mother lacked the legal capacity to sign it. There's a finding in her chart, in a physician's hand, dated before the deed, stating exactly that. A person who cannot understand and execute decisions of consequence cannot convey a $400,000 house. The deed isn't unfair, Rachel. It's void. Not voidable, void. In plain English, that paper never transferred anything. Not for 1 minute. It was dead the day it was signed. Recording an invalid deed doesn't make it valid. It just makes it findable. Second piece of paper. The life estate deed your mother signed 2 years ago, while she still had capacity. Witnessed by a retired probate judge, whose entire reputation is built on knowing what a competent signature looks like. That one stands. It was signed on the right side of the wall. A life estate. In plain English, it means the house was your mother's to live in until the day she dies, and nobody, including Sharon, can put anyone out from under that roof while she's alive. And it directs where the house goes after. We don't have to win it for you. We have to enforce a thing your mother already decided, in front of a witness, when no one could question her mind.
I sat very still. Across the desk, the real plant was real and the lawyer was watching me understand it. "Do you see the difference?" she said. "It's the difference between asking a court to give you something and asking a court to enforce something that already happened. The first is a plea. The second is bookkeeping. You don't sue for the house. You walk into probate court and ask one judge to do two clerical things: declare the void deed void and enforce the valid one. And you, of all people, will appreciate this. It doesn't turn on whether anyone believes you're a good daughter. It turns on a date, a signature, and a finding in a chart. 3 things that don't have feelings." It was the first time since the cake that I felt the floor stop shifting. Not relief. I still didn't trust relief. But the cold, clean click of a count finally coming out even. She'd taken the worst afternoon of my life and reframed it from a thing I had to win into a thing I had to prove, and proving things in writing was the one skill no one in my family had ever thought to count. What I didn't tell her yet, what I hadn't let myself say out loud even alone in the car, was that the deed wasn't the worst thing I was about to find. It wasn't even close. I could feel the shape of it arriving in that office before I had a number to confirm it. There's a part of a person that resists doing the arithmetic when the answer is going to be about your own sister. "There's something else," I said, because I'd carried it up the stairs to her office, the question I didn't want answered. "You keep saying my mother lacked capacity on the day the deed was signed. I believe the chart. But I have to tell you something that doesn't fit, and where I come from, a thing that doesn't fit is a thing you don't bury." I told her about the good days, that my mother had known the cousins' names yesterday, that the right tablets, on time, kept her standing. I'd watched it for 9 years. With her evening dose, she stayed Eleanor, knew the porch was gray, knew on a good morning exactly who had wronged her and who had not. "So how," I said, "does a woman who has good days have a day bad enough to sign a deed? Capacity isn't a wall for her, it's a tide. It comes in and goes out, and it goes out worst when—" I stopped. I didn't finish it. Ms. Okafor didn't make me. She'd gone very quiet, watching me with the look of a careful person watching another careful person walk up to the edge of something neither of them wanted to be true. "When she misses a dose," Ms. Okafor said, quietly. Finishing it after all because somebody had to. "The right dose on time keeps a memory standing," I said. I'd said it to myself 1,000 mornings over a cup of ginger tea and never once heard it the way I heard it now, in a lawyer's office with a void deed between us. Cut 1 dose, and the whole memory leans. Neither of us said the next part. We didn't have to, but Ms. Okafor wrote something down, underlined it twice, and looked up. "Rachel, I need you to do something, and do it carefully, and do it soon, before anyone realizes what it would show. Go home and count your mother's medication. The pack. The log. I need to know if the numbers match the days, because if your mother had a bad day on the day that deed was signed, and she's a woman who has good days, then somebody may have made the bad day, and if somebody made it, you're not holding a property dispute anymore. You're holding a crime. And the proof is sitting in a blister pack in your mother's room, in a count only a nurse would think to take." I drove home with both hands on the wheel and the speed limit exactly. The proof was a count, and it lived in a pack I'd filled with my own hands against a log I'd written in my own hand, and I knew, the way you know the floor of your own kitchen in the dark, exactly how many small white tablets should be left and exactly which days the log should show. I'd built that record without knowing I was building it. 9 years of writing the time down because if it isn't written down, it didn't happen. Now the writing down was about to become the difference between a thing I could prove and a thing they could bury. All I had to do was get to the room and take the count before anyone understood what it would say. I almost made it. Sharon's car was in the driveway when I got home, so was Greg's. The lights were on in the kitchen, and through the window I could see my sister moving around my mother's house with the ease of a woman who'd read a deed over a cake and believed it true. I let myself in the side door, the way I'd come in for 9 years, and Sharon turned from the counter with a face she'd arranged into something soft and tired and reasonable before I was all the way through the door.
Rachel, good. I'm glad you're here. We need to talk, and I want to do it kindly because I don't think either of us wants this to turn into a war.
She set down the dish towel, my dish towel, and folded her hands.
I've been thinking about it all night. I think I came on too strong. The eviction thing, that was the lawyer's idea, the formal way of doing it, and I should have softened it. So here's what I propose. We split it. 50-50. The house, when the time comes. You stay on for now, you keep helping with Mom, and we forget the notice ever happened. I'll have it withdrawn. I just want this family at peace, and Mom at peace, and I don't want to spend her last years fighting you in some courtroom. She smiled, the warm, sad smile from the head of the table. Doesn't that sound better? Doesn't that sound like something we can both live with?
24 hours earlier, it might have worked. It was a good offer, said in a good voice, built precisely for a person who'd spent 9 years letting things go. But I'd been in a lawyer's office that morning. I knew the deed she'd read was void. I knew there was a deed she didn't know existed. And the offer of 50% of a house she didn't actually own wasn't generosity. It was the sound of someone who'd just realized the ground might be soft, reaching for a way to keep me out of the courtroom where the ground would be checked. So I did what Judge Brennan told me. I acted like a daughter who'd been beaten and was grateful for mercy. I let my shoulders come down. I said it sounded better, that I was tired, that I didn't want a war either, that I'd think about it. I let her believe she'd managed me. And then I said the only thing I actually wanted to say, kept light, kept ordinary, a nurse mentioning the obvious. I'm just going to check on Mom and sort out her evening meds. She missed her good window. It's past her dose time. And Sharon's face did a thing. It was small. A flicker. A tightening at the corner of the eyes that didn't match the soft mouth, there and gone in less than a second. The kind of micro-tell I'd spent a career reading off the faces of people telling me a number that wasn't true. Then she recovered, smooth and warm, and stepped, not much, just half a step, between me and the hallway to my mother's room. "Oh, you don't need to worry about that anymore," she said. "Greg and I have it handled. We talked to Mom's doctor's office this week, set everything up properly. It's a temporary healthcare authorization. Since Mom can't really direct her own care now, it just makes sure her medical decisions go through one person, so there's no confusion. It's cleaner this way. Honestly, safer for her." She said, safer for her, the way you'd lay down a card you were sure of. So her medication, her records, the pharmacy, the doctor, that all comes through me now. You've done so much, Rachel. You don't have to carry it anymore. From down the hall, Greg's voice, flat and reasonable. "We figured it was better for everyone. One point of contact. We already had the lock looked at on her door, too. She wanders at night. We didn't want her getting confused and falling. We're just trying to keep her safe." I stood in the kitchen I'd run for 9 years and felt the floor go out from under the morning's clean, even count, because I understood all at once what they'd built while I sat in a lawyer's office learning what I was holding. A wall around my mother, and behind it, a wall around the pack. A temporary medical authorization that made Sharon the single voice for my mother's care. Her records, her pharmacy, her room. A lock, newly looked at, on the bedroom door where a blister pack sat on the nightstand with a count that didn't match a log. They hadn't done it to keep my mother from wandering. They'd done it to keep a nurse from counting. And the timing turned me cold. Sharon had said it herself. careless, sure of her ground. We talked to Mom's doctor's office this week. This week, before the party, before the cake, they'd set the authorization in motion before they ever read the deed out loud, which meant the lock and the single point of contact for the pharmacy weren't a reaction to me fighting back. They were part of the plan from the start. You don't put a wall around a medication pack you have no reason to fear. You build that wall because you already know what counting it would show. Of course, I heard myself say flat, easy. That's a relief, honestly. I'm exhausted. And I smiled and turned toward the hallway like I was only going to say goodnight. And I watched Sharon watch me, watched her wait to see whether I'd walk past her toward that room, and I understood that the next 10 feet of hallway were the whole case. If I didn't get the count tonight, the photograph, the numbers, the log in my own hand before anyone thought to correct it, then by tomorrow the records would route through Sharon, the pharmacy would answer to Sharon, and a fresh pack with a clean log could appear on that nightstand, and the bad day on the day of the deed would dissolve like sugar in cold tea. I'd spent 9 years learning you don't announce a count until you've counted again. I'd never had someone stand in a doorway to keep me from counting at all. They were about to find out what a nurse does when you put a locked door between her and a discrepancy. But the deed was never the thing that frightened Sharon. A void deed is just paper. The blister pack on the nightstand was the thing that could put her in a cell, and she'd just locked it behind a door, 10 feet away, with one night left before what those bubbles spelled out became something they could bury. Here is a thing 9 years of nights in that house had taught me, and it is not a thing you learn in nursing school. A locked door is only ever as strong as the reason the person who locked it can give for it. Sharon had a good reason, the kind you can say out loud in a kitchen with your hands folded. Mom wanders, we don't want her falling, we're keeping her safe. A good reason is a wall, but it has one weakness a bad reason doesn't. It has to keep being given. It has to hold up not once, but every single time someone walks toward the door. I had run that hallway in the dark for 9 years, and I knew exactly how many reasons it took to wear a person down, because I'd been the one wearing down. I didn't walk past her. You don't push on a wall someone's braced against. You let them keep bracing against nothing, and you go around. So I stopped half a step short of the hallway and turned it into the most ordinary sentence in the world. "You're right," I said. "I'm dead on my feet. I'll just look in and say goodnight. I won't even turn the light on. 9 years, Sharon. I can't sleep without seeing she's breathing." And I smiled the tired smile and let it sit there, because the one thing a person braced against a door cannot do is refuse to let a daughter say goodnight to her mother without telling the whole room why. Sharon hesitated. I watched it happen in her shoulders before it reached her face. The same calculation I'd watched run behind 100 reasonable faces over a hospital bed. How much can I deny before the denial itself becomes the thing they remember? Refusing to let me read a deed she could do in daylight with the family watching and call it responsible, but physically keeping a nurse from looking at her sleeping mother in front of Greg, with no audience left to perform for, that was the kind of refusal that leaves a mark on the person who does it, not the person it's done to. She knew it. I watched her know it. "Of course," she said. "Just don't wake her. She had a big day." And she stepped aside. Not all the way. Half. But half was the whole hallway, and I walked it with my pulse slow and flat. A nurse going to look at a patient and nothing else in the world. I didn't know, walking those 10 feet, that the nightstand 4 feet past the door held 2 things, and that the second one would frighten Sharon more than any deed ever could. The new lock was a cheap brass thing, a privacy knob with a thumb turn on the inside, the kind you buy off a peg and call "looked at." It was unlocked. Of course it was. They hadn't locked it against me yet, because in their version of the night I was a beaten daughter who'd accepted mercy and gone to bed. The lock was for tomorrow, for after the authorization routed everything through Sharon and a beaten daughter had no more reason to walk this hall. I had perhaps one night before the brass knob meant what it was bought to mean, and I was standing on the right side of it, and the pack was 4 feet away on the nightstand where it had sat every night for 9 years. My mother was asleep. I am going to tell you almost nothing about how she looked, because she would not want me to, and because the thing that was done to her does not live in how she looked. It lives in a number, and the number is what I went in there for. Only this. She was breathing slow and even, on her side, the way she'd slept her whole life, and the room smelled of the lavender lotion I'd rubbed into her hands that morning. On the nightstand, beside the lamp and the water glass I keep filled, was the blister pack and the dose log in the spiral notebook I'd written in every night for 9 years. I did not turn on the lamp. I had a small light I'd carried for 9 years of night checks, the kind you cup in your hand so it doesn't reach the bed, and I cupped it, and I picked up the pack. You have to understand what a blister pack is to a nurse who fills it herself. It's a calendar you can hold. 28 little sealed bubbles in 4 rows of 7, one for every evening of 4 weeks, and you press the tablet out through the foil on the day you give it. So the empty bubbles behind you are a record of every dose that happened, and the full bubbles ahead are a promise of every dose to come. I filled my mother's pack myself, the last Sunday of every month, with the bottle and the log open in front of me, because I do not trust my own memory and never have. That's not humility. It's training. A nurse who trusts her memory eventually kills someone. So I write it down. The pack in my hand was not a mystery. It was a sentence I had written myself, 1 bubble a night, and all I had to do was read it. I read the empties first, counting backward from today, my thumb finding each pressed bubble in the dark, the way you find the rungs of a ladder you've climbed 1,000 times. And the empties were right, near as I could tell up to a point, and then they weren't. Let me be careful here, because being careful is the entire point of me. I did not, in that dark room, conclude anything. A nurse who concludes in the dark is a nurse who hangs the wrong bag. What I did was notice a discrepancy. The pack should have shown an unbroken run of empties, 1 per night, no gaps, because I do not miss doses. Missing doses is the one thing I exist to not do. And there was a gap. A sealed bubble full, the tablet still sitting whole and white behind its foil, in a row of empties, a single intact dose stranded in the middle of a week that should have been all empty. One night, some night, a tablet that should have been given was not. The bubble behind it empty. The bubble ahead of it empty, just the one, full, in the middle, like a held breath. I counted it again, forward this time, against the calendar in my head, naming the date of each bubble as my thumb crossed it the way you name the streets on a route you could drive asleep, and the full bubble landed on a date. A date I already knew, because I'd laid it against a wall in a lawyer's office that morning and against a finding in a chart the night before. The missing dose, the one bad night stranded in a run of good ones, sat on the bubble for the night before the deed Sharon read over the cake was signed. I want to tell you I felt something dramatic. I didn't. What I felt was the cold, narrow click I've felt maybe a dozen times in my career, the click of 2 numbers that should not match locking together, not relief and not horror, but the thing under both of them, the floor of the building, the moment the chart stops being a stack of pages and becomes a story with a shape. I had spent the whole drive home not wanting it to be the answer it was. It was the answer it was. But a missing dose is not yet a crime. I made myself hold that. People miss doses. An old woman might palm a tablet, spit it back, drop it behind the nightstand. A tired daughter might. 1 full bubble in a run of empties is a discrepancy, not a confession. I'd built my whole defense on the difference between a feeling and a finding, and a stranded tablet was still closer to a feeling. So I did the thing I do. I went to the log. The pack tells you a dose was skipped. The log tells you whether someone tried to pretend it wasn't. I opened the spiral notebook to the right week, holding the cupped light low, and found the line for that night. The night of the full bubble, the night before the deed. And there, in my own neat column where I'd written the date and the time and my own initials every night for 9 years, the line was not in my hand. I knew my own hand. I'd looked at it on those pages for 9 years, the small slanted clinical print of a person who's written 1,000 charts under fluorescent lights at the end of a double, where you write so the next nurse can read it at a glance and nobody dies of your penmanship. My letters lean the same tired way every night. The entry for that night leaned the other way. The date was there, and a time was there, a time I had not written, because I had not given the dose that night, because I remembered that night now. The way you remember a thing once you finally let yourself. I've got Mom's pills today, Rachel. You go put your feet up. and an initial that was not mine, that wanted to look like a checkmark and a scrawl, that wanted the page to say a dose had been given on a night when a full bubble 4 inches away said it had not. Someone had written, "given" on a night the pack said, "skipped." And they'd pressed too hard, the way you do when you're writing a lie into a record you don't usually keep. The pen had bitten the page, dented through to the sheet beneath, in a hand that slanted the wrong way and crossed its sevens, which I do not do, which I have never done, which my mother used to tease me for not doing, because she crossed her sevens, and so did her mother, and so did Sharon. The right dose, on time, keeps a memory standing. Cut 1 dose, and the whole memory leans. 1 dose. The night before a deed. A full bubble, and a forged line on top of it saying the bubble was empty. I did not wake my mother. I did not say a word. I am a nurse. The alarm in me does not make noise. It makes a list. I took the photographs first, the pack, all 28 bubbles in frame so no one could later say I'd staged a single-stranded one, then the pack against the open log so the date lined up in one image, then the log line alone, close, the dented forged initial filling the frame with the lamp clicked on for 2 seconds, because a photograph of evidence taken in the dark is a photograph a lawyer can't use. 2 seconds of light. My mother didn't stir. I turned it off and stood in the dark, letting the after image fade, and thought, with the cold, clean part of me that has gotten me through every shift I ever worked, that is the night someone made. And I thought I'd found the bottom of it. I had 9 years of habit left to open one more drawer, and the bottom was further down than that. And then I did the second thing Ms. Okafor had not even asked me to do, because she didn't know it existed, because nobody in that family knew it existed except me. I went for the rest of it. If they were going to wall off my mother's records and route the pharmacy through Sharon by morning, then everything in that room that told the truth about my mother's mind would be on the wrong side of a brass lock by tomorrow night, and I was on the right side of it now, the one night the lock didn't mean anything yet. In the bottom drawer of my mother's dresser, under the slips she didn't wear anymore, was a flat plastic accordion file I'd kept for 9 years. I'd started it the first year, the way you start keeping a parent's papers when you become the one who takes them to appointments. Every visit summary, every medication change, every neurologist's letter filed by date, because filing by date is the only way I know how to think. The chart at the doctor's office had the official finding, the wall, the date past which a Carlton County physician would no longer swear to my mother's capacity. But I had the shadow of it here, my own copies, the dated letters, the prescription history that would show, line by line, that the medication holding the thread of my mother's mind had been filled by me, on schedule, for 9 years, and exactly when that schedule had a hole in it. I took the file. I'd copy it and put it back, but I took it that night because I could not risk the drawer being a locked drawer by the time I needed it. And under the accordion file, wrapped in a square of the soft cloth she kept her good reading glasses in, was the thing I had come for without admitting I was coming for it. A small digital recorder, the cheap kind, with a single red button, bought years ago for a reason that had nothing to do with any of this. I have to tell you about the recorder, because it is going to matter more than the pack, more than the log, more than the chart, and it wasn't a trap I set. Early, the first or second year, when my mother was still mostly herself, but had started to have the days she called her foggy days, she'd asked me to do something. She'd been a school secretary for 31 years. She trusted the written-down thing and the witnessed thing over anyone's memory, including her own, especially as she felt her own start to thin. One afternoon, clear-eyed, furious in the quiet way she got, she'd said, "Rachel, I want to say some things while I can still say them right, and I want them somewhere, so that nobody later can tell me, or tell you, what I meant." So I'd bought the recorder, and a handful of times over the good years, she'd sit at the kitchen table on a clear morning with a cup of ginger tea going cold and say things into it. Plain things. Who got what she wanted, why. Then she'd have me play it back so she could hear it said what she meant, and nod, and tell me to put it away. For later, she'd say, for when they don't believe me. I'd thought she meant the disease. I'd thought they was the fog. I knew which one to play. There was one she'd made me play back more than any other. One clear October morning maybe 4 years ago, when she was entirely, unmistakably, witheringly herself. I did not play it in that room with her sleeping. I took it out the side door into the yard, into the cold, with the cousin's tire tracks still pressed into the frost on the gravel, and I cupped the speaker against my ear and pressed the single red button. And my mother's voice came out of it, her real voice, the one from before the tide started going out, brisk and dry and certain, the voice that ran an office and missed nothing.
"This is Eleanor Kessler, and I'm in my right mind, and Rachel is going to roll her eyes at me for saying so, but I'm saying it anyway. For the record, the way I always told my girls to do. The house is Rachel's. She lives here. She takes care of me here, and after I'm gone, it's hers. It's already done properly, with Walter as my witness, so don't let anyone tell you different. Sharon doesn't need it, and Sharon will say she does. That's an old argument, and I'm tired of it. I love my children. I'm not a fool about them. Rachel gets the house because Rachel is the one who stayed."
I stood in my mother's yard in the cold and listened to her tell the truth in a voice that no longer existed, and I'll be honest about what I felt. Not triumph. The specific grief of hearing someone you love be completely themselves on a recording when they will never be completely themselves in a room again. Sharon doesn't need it, and Sharon will say she does. That's an old argument. My mother had known. 4 years ago, clear as October, she had known exactly which daughter would one day stand over a deed and which daughter would one day stand over a pack, and she had tried, in the only way a careful woman knows, to write it down before the writing got hard. For when they don't believe me. I'd thought she meant the fog. She'd meant Sharon. I put the recorder in my pocket where the eviction notice had been and the judge's envelope had been, and I went back inside and told Sharon good night and told Greg good night and climbed the stairs to the room across the hall and lay down in the dark with my mother's voice and my mother's pack and my mother's chart and a forged line in my own notebook. And I did not sleep, and around 2 a.m. I did the arithmetic I'd been refusing to do since I read a sentence off a nurse's shoulder in a gray plastic chair. Let me lay it out the way I laid it out on the ceiling that night. 9 years I cared for my mother. A deed got read over her 80th birthday cake handing the house to Sharon. An eviction notice got slid across to me. There was an earlier deed, signed 2 years ago while my mother was still sharp, witnessed by a retired probate judge, sitting in a lawyer's drawer. The deed Sharon read wasn't even the first one, and the deed Sharon read was signed after the date a Carlton County doctor put a wall in my mother's chart, which made it void. Sharon never got the house, not for 1 day, not on paper, not at all. And now the fourth thing, the thing I'd pressed into the ceiling at 2 a.m, my mother's medication had a hole in it on the night before that deed was signed, and the hole had been papered over with a lie in my sister's hand. And here is where the floor of the case dropped out of the property dispute and turned into something I had no training to hold. Because a void deed is a clerical problem. You take it to a judge, the judge declares it void, the paper that never transferred anything is named as paper that never transferred anything, and a careful person enforces the real deed and goes home. Sad, ugly, but clerical. That was the case Ms. Okafor had built, and it was a good case, and it asked no one to believe anything about anyone's heart. But a void deed signed the night after a particular dose was skipped, the skip papered over with a forgery in a particular hand, that is not clerical. A person does not need a stranded tablet to record a deed in error. A person who simply didn't know the first deed existed, who genuinely believed Mom wanted it this way, leaves the pack alone because that person has no reason on earth to touch a blister pack. You only build a wall around the medication if you know what counting it would show. You only forge a line saying a dose was given if you know a skipped dose is the thing that made the signature possible. The deed was greed, and greed is a civil matter. But the dose was a decision. Somebody decided that the cheapest, surest way to get a sharp old woman to sign away a $480,000 house was to make sure she had a foggy day on the day she signed, to reach into the one thing that held the thread of her mind and take a single thread out, on schedule, on purpose, and then write "given" over the gap. That is not a civil matter. I am not a lawyer, but I am a mandatory reporter, and I knew the shape of the words for it before I knew the statute numbers. A person responsible for the care of a vulnerable adult who intentionally withholds necessary medication to cause harm or to obtain something of value has not committed a paperwork foul. They have committed a crime. The deed was theft. The dose was abuse of a dependent person on purpose for money. And the proof of it was sitting in a blister pack in a room they were about to lock, photographed 2 nights running by the one person who'd think to count it. I lay there and let that arrive all the way to the end before I felt it, the way Judge Brennan had made me promise to. Civil to criminal, a house to a body. My sister hadn't just lied about what my mother wanted. She had reached into my mother's evening dose and taken a thread out of her on purpose to make her sign, and then handed me an eviction notice across her own birthday cake. And I would like to tell you that was the bottom of it. That at 2 a.m, with my mother's voice in my pocket and the worst arithmetic of my life finished on the ceiling, I had finally counted everything there was to count. I hadn't. There was one more count, and it was the one that took the floor out from under the whole house, and out from under the idea I'd carried my whole life of who my sister was. And it came, the way the worst ones always come, from a place I wasn't even looking. It came from the accordion file. I'd taken the file for the prescription history to corroborate the pack and the log, but the file was 9 years deep, and I am a person who files by date and cannot help it, and somewhere in the back of it, behind my mother's papers, were papers that weren't hers. They were my grandmother's, Grandma Ruth Hale, my mother's mother, who had died 7 years ago, the second year I was home, when I was so deep in learning how to care for my mother that I'd barely surfaced for the funeral. I'd ended up with a folder of her papers the way you end up with these things. Somebody hands you a folder at a funeral because you're the one who keeps papers, and you file it by date and never look at it again. Until I was sitting on my bedroom floor at 3 a.m. needing to be sure of a date, and I pulled the wrong section, and my grandmother's papers fell into my lap. I almost put them back, and then a single word on a single page caught the cupped light and stopped me, because it was a word I had just spent the whole night learning to be afraid of. Grandma Ruth Hale had owned a house, too. A smaller one, 2 towns over, the one my mother grew up in. And in the folder somebody had handed me at a funeral 7 years ago was the paper trail of what had happened to it, and I sat on the floor and read it cold by the cupped light, the way I'd read the pack, counting, and it came out the same way, with that narrow click of 2 things locking that should never have been allowed to touch. There had been a caregiver. Not me. I was deep in my mother by then. It had been Patty, my cousin Patricia, Patty Doyle, Grandma Ruth's niece, who'd moved in the last 2 years and done for her exactly what I'd done for my mother. The meals and the meds and the long nights, the unpaid, thankless, invisible work. And there had been a deed, late, signed near the end, that moved Grandma Ruth's house away from Patty and toward the daughter who handled the family's money, my aunt. But the person who drew it up, who handled the paperwork, who'd stepped in near the end to take the burden of the legal side off everyone, whose name was on the cover letter in the brisk handling voice of someone managing a transaction, was Sharon. Sharon had run my grandmother's estate 7 years ago, the same way. A caregiver edged out at the end by a deed that appeared late and moved the house toward the people who handled the money. Patty had said nothing. Patty had taken the small thing she was left and signed where she was told and gone home and never spoken of it again. Because what was she going to do? Fight the family over a house? Get called grasping and bitter and jealous of the relatives who'd been responsible with money while she was just the one who'd wiped the chin? I knew, reading it, exactly why Patty had stayed quiet, because it was the same machine that had been built to keep me quiet, and it had worked on her, and they had every reason to believe it would work on me. I sat on the floor of the room I'd been given 30 days to leave, and I understood the thing that turns a grievance into something with a much longer spine. My mother was not the victim of a sister who'd panicked under private debt and done one terrible thing in a tight corner. That was the version I'd been half-building all night, the one where Sharon was desperate, where there was a story that made it almost human. There wasn't. My mother was the second one. 7 years apart, the same play, run by the same hand. Find the house going to the wrong person, wait for the end of a life, produce a late deed, and lean on the caregiver, because the caregiver is tired and grieving and used to giving things up, and has spent so long letting things go that letting it go is the only move she knows. Patty had been the dress rehearsal. My mother was the performance. And the only reason it hadn't run clean a second time was that this time the caregiver had spent 9 years writing the time down and crossed her sevens the same way every night and bought a recorder and would not conclude in the dark. The recap I'd been carrying got one fact heavier on that floor, and it was the heaviest yet. 9 years, a deed over the cake, a nurse they all forgot. An earlier deed signed sharp, witnessed by a judge. The later deed signed after the wall in the chart. Void. A dose missing the night before, forged over in Sharon's hand. A crime, not a foul. And now the last and worst. She had done it before. To Grandma Ruth, to Patty. My mother was not a tragedy. My mother was a pattern, and patterns, unlike panics, do not get the benefit of the doubt. Not from me, and I was beginning to understand, not from a court either, once a careful person laid 2 estates side by side and let the dates do the talking. I did not call Ms. Okafor at 3 a.m. I wanted to. I held the phone in the dark, and I did not, because a nurse who calls the doctor before she has the full count gets a doctor who stops listening, and I wanted Ruth Okafor to hear this with the whole pack on the table, the photographs and the log and the chart and the recorder and a 7-year-old folder from a funeral nobody thought I'd kept. I lay back down. I watched the window go from black to the gray that comes before light, the gray of the porch in my mother's recording. And somewhere down the hall, the brass thumb-turn sat on a door that didn't mean anything yet. On the last night, it wouldn't. In the morning, I made my mother her tea. Ginger, a coin of it cut thin, the kettle just off the boil the way she liked, in the cup that was hers. And I sat with her by the window while it was still hot for once, and watched her hold it in both hands, and she didn't know my name that morning. And I let that be true for exactly as long as it took to be true and not 1 second longer, because she was still my mother, and a cup of tea on time was still a cup of tea on time whether she knew my name or not. That was the inheritance, and I already knew it, sitting there. Not the house. The tea, on time, every morning. Then I drove to Ruth Okafor's office with a plastic accordion file on the passenger seat and a recorder in my pocket, both hands on the wheel and the speed limit exactly, and I carried it all up the stairs past the real plant and set it on her desk in the order I'd worked out at 3 a.m. Pack, log, chart, the 7-year-old folder last, the way you save the number that changes the diagnosis for the end. She put on her glasses. She did not interrupt me once, which I would later learn was the most alarmed Ruth Okafor ever got. She listened to all of it, piece after piece. And when I played her 30 seconds of my mother's voice telling an October morning 4 years gone exactly which daughter stayed, I watched a lawyer who held things in drawers for years without flinching, put her pen down very carefully, the way you set down something you've realized is heavier than it looks. "Rachel," she said, when it was done, in a voice that had gone quiet and level and a little cold around the edges. "You came in here yesterday holding a property dispute. Do you understand what you're holding now?" She didn't wait. She reached for a fresh legal pad and wrote a date at the top. Not today's date, but a court date. The next open one on the Carleton County probate calendar, which she already knew by heart. "Because what you have on this desk doesn't just take back a house. It puts your sister in a room, under oath, in front of your whole family, on a record she can't take back, and it asks her to explain a blister pack." She uncapped the pen. "And I think we should let her try." But the deed Ms. Okafor would name void in open court was never the evidence that frightened Sharon. A void deed only loses you a house. What sat photographed in my pocket, a single full bubble in a run of empties, dated the night before her signature, with given forged over the gap in a hand that crossed its sevens, could lose her the rest of her life. The house was the argument we'd open with. The pill pack was the one she'd have to answer. I came home the way you come home, carrying the thing that's going to take the house back. Not tall, not triumphant, tired. The specific tiredness of a person who has just handed a heavy thing to someone stronger and felt her own arms start to shake the second they were empty. Ms. Okafor had the file now, the recorder copied twice, the original sealed in an envelope she'd signed across the flap, a date at the top of a fresh legal pad, and I had to go home and live inside that house, across a hall from a brass thumb turn, for the 11 days it would take to reach that date, pouring ginger tea, saying goodnight, pretending I was still a beaten daughter, while a court got quietly built around all of us, scaffolding nobody else could see yet. Ms. Okafor's whole strategy was that Sharon could not be allowed to know the floor had moved. The moment Sharon understood there was an earlier deed, a missing dose, a recorder, the case got harder because a person who knows what's coming starts cleaning. Records develop holes. Pharmacies get calls with corrections. Right now, your sister thinks she's won and is waiting for you to leave quietly. That's the most useful thing she will ever do for us. Let her. So I did. The hardest acting I have ever done was the 11 days I spent looking like a woman who had lost. And somewhere in those 11 days, without meaning to, I found the seam that would split my family in half. And it wasn't Sharon. But this act isn't about the 11 days. It's about what cracked inside the house before we ever got near a courtroom. Because something did, and it taught me the thing I needed before I walked into that probate room. The wall I'd been calling the family was never one wall. It was two people leaning on each other, and two people leaning on each other can be parted if you stop pushing on the wall and start watching the seam. The seam was Greg. My brother had been a particular kind of guilty all along, the kind that's worse than malice in some ways and far more fragile in others. He hadn't drawn up a deed, he hadn't forged a line or reached into a blister pack. What Greg had done was smaller and, to a court, almost nothing, but to a family it was the load-bearing thing. Greg had locked a door so Mom could rest. Greg had stood in a circle of cousins on the night of the cake and, when Sharon needed a second voice, supplied it. Rachel's been under a lot of strain. She's not really herself. Somebody had to step in. Greg was the bracket that held the engine to the frame, and brackets are the first thing to fail because they were never built to carry the load alone. They were built to agree. I didn't go at Greg. I never went at anybody. Going at people is how they get to stay sure of themselves. Nothing reassures a person who's done wrong like being yelled at, because then they get to be the one who's attacked. So I didn't accuse Greg of anything. I just stopped protecting him from what the notebook would say. It happened on the 9th night. Greg had been around more those days, orbiting the way a person orbits a thing they're not sure they want to look at directly. He found me at the kitchen table with the spiral notebook open. Not the forged page. Ms. Okafor had the original. A fresh page. I was writing down the evening dose, date and time, and my initials, the way I'd done for 9 years, crossing my sevens the way I do. And he sat down with a beer he didn't open, and watched me write, and then said the thing that told me the bracket was already failing under a load he didn't understand yet.
You really wrote in that thing every night? For 9 years?
And I said yes, that's all. I turned the notebook around so he could see, not the forged page, just the 9 years of it, columns and columns of small slanted clinical print, date-time initials, 1,000 nights of a person being where she said she was, in ink. I let him hold the weight of it, and I said, mild as milk. I cross my sevens the regular way. Mom always teased me for it. Everybody in this family crosses their sevens except me. And I watched my brother go still. Because Greg had seen the deed, he'd stood there while Sharon read it, and in the 9 days since I'd come home quiet and stopped fighting, which frightens the guilty far more than fighting does, he'd started doing the arithmetic guilty people do at night, the what exactly did I sign my name next to. He hadn't seen the forged log line. He didn't know about the missing dose. but he was looking at 9 years of handwriting that crossed its sevens one specific way. And I could see him remembering faintly that there had been other handwriting lately on things, and not knowing what it meant, and being, for the first time, afraid of what it might. I didn't tell him. That was the discipline of it. I had the whole thing, the pack, the log, the chart, the recorder, the 7-year-old folder with Patty's name and Grandma Ruth's house in it, and I handed my brother none of it across that table, because a person who is handed the truth gets to decide what to do with it, and what I needed from Greg was not a decision. It was a doubt. I needed him to walk into that probate room still believing he'd backed the right sister, so the floor would come out from under him in front of everyone at the same instant it came out from under Sharon, because a bracket that fails in private can be quietly re-welded, but a bracket that fails in public, in the half-second a recording plays, fails for good. So I closed the notebook, I said goodnight, and I let my brother sit at that kitchen table with a beer he never opened, and the first real doubt he'd ever had about the sister he'd spent his whole life following, and I went up the stairs and lay in the dark and listened to him not leave for a long time, and I knew the seam had started. You don't have to break a wall. You just have to find the day the two halves stop being sure of each other and let them stand there alone, holding nothing. 11 days later, we walked into a small bright room at the Carlton County Courthouse, and I let the paper I'd built in the dark do the one thing I never could, say my sister's name out loud. The morning of the hearing was clear and cold, the gray going to light gray of my mother's October recording, and I did the only thing that made sense to do with a morning like that. I made my mother her tea. Ginger, a thin coin of it, the kettle just off the boil. I sat with her by the window while it was hot. She held it in both hands. She knew my name that morning. It was one of the mornings she did. And she looked at me over the cup and said, "Rachel," the way she'd said it for 60 years, a little exasperated, like I'd done something, and I said, "Yeah, Mom." And that was the whole conversation, and it was the richest thing I owned. Then a homemade I trusted came to sit with her, because my mother was not going anywhere near that courtroom. That was the one line I would not cross. My mother would sit by her own window with her own tea while other people fought over the house she already knew the truth about. And I drove to the Carlton County Probate Court with nothing in my hands, because Ms. Okafor had everything, because that was the point. The man who met me on the courthouse steps was the one the family had spent 9 years not seeing at all, and the whole shape of this turned on him. Walter Brennan, the cranky old man next door, the one who complained about the leaves, the one nobody in my family had ever bothered to be afraid of because he was old and lived alone and trimmed his own hedge. He was waiting at the top of the steps in a gray suit I'd never seen. I'd only ever seen him in a cardigan over a hedge, and in the suit he looked like exactly what he'd been for 31 years before he retired into the house next to my mother's, a probate judge. He had witnessed my mother's real deed 2 years ago at her own kitchen table, the deed that sat in Ms. Okafor's drawer. He was not the judge on this case. He couldn't be. He was a witness now. But he'd be in that room as the man who had sat across from Eleanor Kessler when she was sharp as a tack, and watched her sign the house to the daughter who stayed. And on those steps, before we went in, he told me the thing I think was the real spine of the whole story.
"I'm going to tell you something, and then we're going to go in there and not be sentimental about it," he said. 31 years on that bench, I watched families do this to each other. Somebody handles the money, somebody does the caring, and at the end the one who handled the money produces the paper, and the one who did the caring is too tired to fight it. And I'd bang the gavel and call it settled, because the paper was in order. The paper is always in order, Rachel. That's the trick of it. I retired thinking I'd been fair my whole life because I followed the paper. He looked out over the parking lot. Then I moved in next to your mother, and I watched you carry groceries and run that hallway at night for 9 years. And I watched the rest of them come by on Sundays and leave before the hard part. Your mother asked me to witness a deed, and I said yes, because I had finally figured out that the clean paper was where the lie lived. So this time, I'm not going to sit in the back and let the paper win. I sat at her table. I know what she wanted, and I'm going to say so out loud in a room, which is a thing I should have done from the bench about 40 times and didn't. He put his hand on the courthouse door. Let's go let your sister explain a blister pack.
A man who'd spent his whole working life being fair the easy way, follow the form, let the form carry the conscience, telling me on a cold morning that fairness by form is how the careful thieves win, every time, because they're the ones who keep the forms. That was Judge Brennan. My family had been right that he watched everything. They were only wrong about what he was waiting to see. And then we went inside, and I'm going to give you the room the way it actually happened, in order, because that's the only honest way to tell you what it is to watch a thing you built in the dark walk out into the light and do exactly what you built it to do. The probate room at Carleton County is small and bright and ordinary, more like a place you'd renew a license than a place where a house changes hands. Wood benches, a flag, a judge, the sitting one, a woman named Holloway with reading glasses on a chain, and the unhurried manner of someone who has heard every kind of family say every kind of thing. My family filled 2 rows. Sharon in navy, composed, a leather folder in front of her, the picture of the responsible one who handles the money. She'd brought her own paper, of course, Greg beside her, but I noticed, the way I notice a respiratory rate, that he'd left a hand's width of bench between them that hadn't been there at the cake. Cousins behind, and me at the petitioner's table next to Ruth Okafor, who had one slim folder and her hands folded on top of it, looking like the least armed person in the room. Sharon's lawyer went first, and he was good and brief, and he did exactly what I'd been told he would. He made it small, a recorded deed, properly executed, transferring the property to Sharon Kessler Vance. The petitioner, me, was disputing it out of, his word, understandable emotion, having been the live-in caregiver, but emotion was not a defect in title. He asked the court to confirm the deed and dismiss the petition. He sat down. It took 4 minutes. The paper was clean. I watched Sharon's shoulders settle as he sat, the small physical relief of a person hearing her own version said back to her in a lawyer's calm voice. And I thought, that's the last easy breath you're going to take in this room, and you don't know it. Then Ruth Okafor stood, and she did not raise her voice, and she never raised it once in the next 40 minutes. Everything that happened in that room happened at the volume of a woman reading a grocery list. She said the petitioner did not dispute that a deed had been recorded. She said the petitioner would show the court 3 things in order and then ask for one ruling, like a person laying tools out on a cloth. The first thing was the dates. She put 2 deeds in front of the court, Sharon's, the recorded one, and a second, older one that made Sharon's lawyer lean forward because he'd never heard of it. The life estate deed, signed 2 years ago. Witnessed, and here Ms. Okafor asked the court's leave for the witness to be identified, and Walter Brennan stood up in the gallery in his gray suit, and I watched my whole family turn and look at the cranky old man next door and not understand, yet, what they were looking at. A life estate just means my mother kept the right to live in her own home for the rest of her life, and the house came to me when she was gone. Recorded quietly, real, first. And then Ms. Okafor laid down the date that turned the dispute into a problem. A medical finding, from my mother's own chart, from a Carleton County physician, a date past which that doctor would no longer attest to my mother's testamentary capacity. A wall in the chart. And she set Sharon's deed's signing date next to it, and the signing date was on the wrong side of the wall. After. She let the 2 numbers sit beside each other on the projector, the wall and the signature after it, and she said in her grocery list voice that a deed signed by a person a physician would not certify as competent is not an unfair deed. It is a void one. It transferred nothing. Dead paper. It never moved the house an inch. I was watching Sharon because Ms. Okafor had told me to. The judge will rule on paper, but your sister will tell you the truth with her body before the judge says a word. And at the word void, Sharon did the first thing. Very small. Her hand, resting flat on the leather folder, pressed down. the knuckles paling, the way you'd press a thing to keep it from sliding off a tilting table. Her face didn't move, but the hand pressed, and I thought, she's known the dates the whole time. That's not the hand of someone surprised. That's the hand of someone who hoped no one else would do the arithmetic. That was the deed, the clerical problem Ms. Okafor could have walked in with on day one and won the house with and gone home. And if she'd stopped there, Sharon walks out having lost a house and kept a reputation, the unlucky one, who recorded a deed that turned out to be technically too late, sad, ugly, clerical. Ms. Okafor did not stop there. The second thing was the pack. She asked the court's indulgence for a brief matter of nursing record-keeping and put the photographs up, the ones I'd taken in the dark with 2 seconds of lamplight, the blister pack, all 28 bubbles in frame, the one stranded full bubble in a run of empties. And she had me sworn, and I told the room what a blister pack is to a nurse who fills it herself. A calendar you can hold. I'd filled my mother's myself the last Sunday of every month for 9 years. I told them about the gap. 1 dose, sealed, full, the tablet whole behind the foil, on a single night in a run of nights that should have been unbroken. And Ms. Okafor put the dose log up beside it, the spiral notebook, open to that night, and she asked me whose handwriting was on the line for that night. And I said not mine. I told them about the 7s. I'd crossed mine the same way for 9 years. My mother used to tease me for being the only one in the family who didn't cross them the regular way. The forged line crossed its 7 the regular way and bit the page the way a pen bites when a person presses too hard, writing a thing they don't usually write. The line said a dose was given on a night the pack 4 inches away said a dose was skipped. I did not say my sister's name. Ms. Okafor had been clear. You state what a nurse can state. You found a skipped dose papered over by a hand that crosses its 7s on the night before the void deed. You do not accuse, you count. The room will do the rest. So I counted. I put the pack and the log on the table and I stood still, and I let my sister do the rest, because she already had. She'd read the date out loud over the cake herself, in her own carrying voice, with a camera running. She'd brought her own paper. She'd told a room full of witnesses, "We talked about this, Mom," to a woman who couldn't have. Every wall she'd built to keep me from counting was a wall that only stands if there's nothing to count. I didn't have to expose Sharon. Sharon had spent 3 weeks of phone calls and 1 birthday cake exposing herself, and all I'd done was keep the receipts and decline to look away. So I counted, and I watched the room do the rest. I watched it travel. That's the thing I'll never forget. An understanding moving through a room 1 face at a time, like a light coming on down a row of windows. A skipped dose, a forged line saying it wasn't skipped. The night before, a deed. Somebody had reached into the medication that held the thread of an old woman's mind on the night before she signed, and then written, "Given," over the whole. You don't have to say the rest in a room full of people who can do arithmetic. I saw a cousin in the second row turn her head slowly toward Sharon. I saw Sharon's lawyer stop writing. And I saw Greg. Greg, who had not seen the pack, who had not known about the dose, who had spent 11 days orbiting a doubt he couldn't name. Greg got there. I watched my brother get there in real time, the whole thing assembling behind his eyes. The locked door he'd defended, the mom needs her rest, the handwriting he'd half noticed lately, the sister he'd backed at the cake, all of it clicking into the shape it actually was, which was that he had lent his voice to cover for a person who'd been thinning their mother's mind on a schedule to make her sign. His face didn't crumple. It emptied. He looked at the side of Sharon's head with an expression I'd never seen on my brother in 40 years, and the hand's width of bench he'd left between them at the start of the morning. I watched him widen it, 6 inches maybe, on a wooden bench in a quiet room. It is the loudest thing my brother has ever said. The bracket failed in public, and it failed for good. And Sharon did the second thing. The water glass. There was a paper cup of water in front of her, and her hand, the same hand that had pressed flat on the folder at void, moved, I think, to do something ordinary, to reach for water the way you do when your mouth has gone dry because the floor is going, and it caught the edge of the cup, and the cup went over. Not dramatically. It just tipped, and the water ran out toward her leather folder, and she had to half stand to keep her papers out of it. My composed sister, on her feet in a courtroom, mopping water off her folder with her own sleeve, clumsy in front of the whole family, and her face finally did the thing it hadn't done at Void. The jaw set, hard, the muscle at the corners standing out, a person clamping down to keep her face from doing anything worse. That was the tell, not tears. A jaw clamping shut over a spilled cup, while the family watched her scramble. Miss Okafor never paused. She let my sister stand there in the water. And then the third thing, the recorder. Ms. Okafor said the petitioner would offer one piece of evidence as to the testator's wishes, recorded by the testator herself, at her own request, while competent. She asked the court's leave to play 30 seconds, and Judge Holloway, who had been very still through the pack, took off her reading glasses and set them down and said, "Go ahead," in the voice of a person who had also, by then, done the arithmetic. And my mother's voice came into that room.
"This is Eleanor Kessler, and I'm in my right mind, and Rachel is going to roll her eyes at me for saying so, but I'm saying it anyway, for the record, the way I always told my girls to do. The house is Rachel's. She lives here, she takes care of me here, and after I'm gone it's hers. It's already done properly, with Walter as my witness, so don't let anyone tell you different. Sharon doesn't need it, and Sharon will say she does. That's an old argument, and I'm tired of it. I love my children. I'm not a fool about them. Rachel gets the house because Rachel is the one who stayed."
My mother's real voice, brisk and dry and entirely herself, the voice that ran a school office for 31 years and missed nothing, filling a courtroom where her present-day self would never have to sit. Sharon doesn't need it, and Sharon will say she does. 4 years before the cake, before the deed, before the dose, she'd sat at her own kitchen table on a clear October morning and named the exact argument her oldest daughter would one day make. Named it tired, named it old, and put it on a recording for the day they wouldn't believe her. The room was completely silent. I have been in rooms when a patient dies, and they are not as silent as that room was when my mother stopped talking. And at the very end, at Slid, Sharon did the last thing, the smallest and the worst and the one I will carry, because the body tells the truth before the gavel does. Sharon, still half standing over her water-wet folder, closed her eyes. That was all. The way you do when you're hit by a thing you cannot stop and cannot answer, and have been bracing against for 11 days. And when she opened them, she did not look at me, and she did not look at Greg, who had moved 6 inches away, and she did not look at the cousins. She looked down at the water on the table. I did not feel what I thought I'd feel. I thought I'd feel the loud, clean rush of being right out loud at last. I didn't. I felt the floor of the building feeling, 2 things locking that should never have had to touch. My mother's voice had filled a courtroom because my mother could no longer fill a room. That is not a triumphant sentence. That is the price of the win, and it was paid by a woman sitting at home by a window, holding a cup of ginger tea, and I never once let myself forget who paid it. Judge Holloway put her glasses back on. She did not make a speech. The judges who make speeches are performing, and she had nothing to perform. She had paper and a recording and the arithmetic. She said, for the record, in a flat, clear voice, that the deed recorded by Sharon Kessler Vance was executed on a date for which the court had a contemporaneous medical finding that the grantor lacked capacity, and that the deed was therefore void and conveyed no interest, that it would be stricken as a cloud on title, a false claim hanging over a house, and she was wiping Sharon's off it. She said the prior recorded instrument, the life estate deed, witnessed, executed while capacity was uncontested, was valid and in full effect, and that the life estate in Rachel M. Kessler was confirmed as of this date, the right of occupancy and the remainder both, effective immediately. Mine for keeps. The house had never been Sharon's, not for a day. The deed that handed it over the birthday cake had transferred exactly nothing, because the house had already, 2 years and 1 clear October before, quietly become mine. And then she did the thing that turned a property ruling into the rest of Sharon's life. She looked up over her glasses and said that the matters raised regarding the medication record and the dose log were beyond the scope of a probate confirmation, but that the court was a mandatory reporter of suspected abuse of a dependent adult, and that the evidence presented, a skipped dose, an altered care log on the eve of a void conveyance, would be referred that morning to the county prosecutor and to Adult Protective Services. She said it as flatly as she'd said the rest, in the same room, in front of the same family that had spent the night of the cake, watching Sharon slide me an eviction notice and nod along to the story that I was the unstable one, the room that had circled me. She did not have to look at Sharon when she said it. Nobody in that room looked at anybody but Sharon. I did not stand up tall. I stayed in my chair next to Ruth Okafor and felt her hand come down on my forearm once, briefly, the most she ever showed, and I watched the deputy clerk hand a single sheet of paper across to our table, the court's confirmation of the life estate, and I held it, warm from the printer, the lightest, heaviest thing I have ever held, while across the room my sister was being handed a different kind of paper by a different kind of officer. I did not feel like a winner. I felt like a nurse at the end of a very long shift who had finally gotten the count right, and the getting it right had cost a great deal, and it had come out even anyway, and right is right even when it's this expensive. Sharon had brought her own paper to that courtroom. She left with someone else's. Here is the part the family did not expect, the part I'd decided on at 3 a.m. before I ever knew how the room would go, because you don't decide who you are in the moment of winning. You decide it before, in the dark, when winning isn't promised. I did not need mercy, and I did not offer it. The back pay came first. Ms. Okafor had built it on the caregiver agreement my mother had signed alongside the life estate deed 2 years before, a contract, witnessed, that put a number on the unpaid, thankless, invisible work of being the one who stays, and made it a debt of the estate. 9 years of it. The court confirmed it the way it confirmed the deed, and because Sharon and Greg, as the estate's other heirs, had moved to take the house and treat it as an asset they'd collect on, there was a reckoning that ran the other way now. They owed the estate, and through it me, for 9 years of care that a contract said was real labor with a real price, and for the time they'd spent acting as owners of a house that was never theirs. There was no generosity in it, and I did not pretend there was. It was the bill, finally itemized, for work done in the dark for 9 years, while the people now paying it had come by on Sundays and left before the hard part. And it didn't require a single raised voice. It required a contract, witnessed 2 years early by a careful woman who saw all of this coming. And then I set the no contact, and I want to tell you exactly what it was and wasn't, because the family told a version where I cut them off out of bitterness, and that is not what happened. I told Sharon, through Ms. Okafor in writing, that I would not be speaking with her again, not in anger, not as punishment, but because a person who reaches into her mother's medication to make her sign is a person you do not let back into the house where your mother lives, ever. And there is no apology that changes that arithmetic. Greg, I left a door open, the narrowest one, not because what he did was small, but because what he did by following. And on a wooden bench in a quiet courtroom, I had watched him stop following, watched him move 6 inches away from his sister at the exact instant it cost him everything. I didn't walk through it toward him, but I left it open. That was the most forgiveness I had, and I gave it where it was earned and nowhere it wasn't. The back pay and the rent, when it came, slowly, in payments arranged by lawyers, I did not spend on myself. I set it into a fund Ms. Okafor helped me build the right way, an in-home care fund in my mother's name, structured so the money does exactly one thing: keep my mother in her own house, cared for the way she wanted for the rest of her life. The aid I trust on the days I can't, the right specialist when she needs one, the thread of her mind held with the right dose, on time, by the people my mother would have chosen, in the room with the window she likes. They thought the house was the asset. The asset was a guarantee that the one thing my mother had asked for in her own brisk voice on a clear October morning, for when they wouldn't believe her, would actually, finally, be true. I drove home from the courthouse with a warm sheet of paper on the passenger seat where the accordion file had ridden in, and I went inside the house that was, in a way it had always quietly been, mine. The aide had gone. My mother was by the window, the afternoon light on her hands. And I did the thing I have done 10,000 times and will do 10,000 more, the thing that turned out to be the whole point of all of it. I put the kettle on, I cut a thin coin of ginger. I waited for the kettle to come just off the boil, the way she likes it, not a rolling boil that scalds the ginger and turns it sharp. I poured it into the cup that is hers, the one with the thin chip on the rim and the faded blue cornflowers, the cup she'd carried from the house she grew up in, the one she'd refused to throw out through 40 years of better china, because some things you keep not for what they're worth, but for whose hands have held them. And I set it in front of my mother, on time, the way I have through every single thing I have just told you, the cake and the deed and the eviction notice and the locked door and the dark room and the courtroom, because the tea kept coming on time the whole way through, because that is what staying is. It doesn't pause for the war, it pours the tea. The morning it had been bitter. The morning Sharon said, "I've got Mom's pills today, Rachel. You go put your feet up." The morning the cup went cold by the window, and a single dose went missing, and my mother leaned the way a memory leans when you pull a thread out of it. That morning was over now. It had been over the moment a judge said, "Vested." This cup was hot and on time, and poured by the one who stays, in the house she stays in, and my mother wrapped both hands around it the way she has for 9 years, and for a moment, in the afternoon light, she was just a woman with a warm cup of tea by a window in her own home, which is all she ever wanted to be, and all of it, every count, every page, every dark hour, had only ever been in service of making sure she got to stay exactly that. They thought the house was the inheritance. The inheritance was a cup of tea, on time, every morning. So let me tell you the thing I've come all this way to say, and then I'll let you go. We have built a quiet agreement to pretend that caring for the people who can no longer care for themselves is not work. We call it love, which it is, and we use the word love to avoid the word labor, because labor has a price and love is supposed to be free, and that suits everyone who isn't doing it just fine. The daughter who stays gets called the lucky one. She gets to be close to mom, as if proximity to a person disappearing were a gift and not the hardest 9 years of a life. And the relative who handles the money gets the standing, the benefit of every doubt. Because we've decided that handling money is competence and wiping a chin is just love being love. So when the paperwork relative produces a deed at the end and the caregiver is too tired and too sad to fight it, we look at the clean paper and call it settled. The paper is always clean. A judge who spent 31 years on the bench told me on a courthouse step that the clean paper is exactly where the lie has always lived. Caring for a vulnerable person is labor. It has a value the law can name if someone bothers to write it down, and I bothered for 9 years, date and time and initials, crossing my sevens the wrong way every night, not because I knew this was coming, but because a nurse writes it down, because a nurse does not trust her own memory, because the writing down is the respect. And being good with money has never once given anyone the right to harm the person they were supposed to protect in order to get more of it. There is no amount of debt, no fear of poverty that turns reaching into your mother's medication into anything other than what it is. Sharon was not desperate. I'd believed she was, for one long night, and then a folder from a funeral 7 years gone taught me she'd done it before. To her own grandmother, to a cousin who stayed quiet, and a thing you do twice, 7 years apart, the same careful way, is not a panic. It is a method, and the only reason the method failed the second time is that the second caregiver wrote it down. Write it down. That's the whole of what I have for you. If you are the one who stays, and some of you watching are, I know you are, I can feel you out there in the dark in the houses where the tea goes cold, write it down. The dates, the doses, the times. Not because you think anyone will ever do this to you. You won't believe they would right up until the cake gets cut. Write it down because the writing down is how the truth survives the day they decide to rewrite it. The paper is always clean on the other side. Make yours cleaner. Cross your sevens your own way every single time, so the day a forged line shows up in your own notebook, the lie has to lean the wrong way to live there, and you'll see it, the way I saw it. And forgiveness. People ask me about forgiveness because no contact sounds hard and they want to know if I've made my peace. I have. I decided what forgiveness was a long time ago, at 3 a.m, before I knew I'd win. Forgiveness, I decided, is a cup of tea every morning on time for the one who can't make her own. That is the whole of the forgiveness I have, and I pour it out fresh every single day into a cup by a window for my mother. Reconciliation is a different word. Reconciliation is letting the person who pulled the thread out of my mother's mind back into the house where my mother is, and that word I do not have. Drawing a permanent line against a person who would harm the weak is not the same as bitterness. It's the opposite. It's the thing love does when it grows up and learns to also be a wall. You can forgive a person and still never ever let them back into the room where the vulnerable one sleeps. I learned that the hard way, in the dark, with a blister pack, and I'm handing it to you now so you don't have to learn it the way I did. If you've watched this far, and it has been a long way, and you stayed and I notice the people who stay, then do one thing for me. Down in the comments, tell me, 9 years of caring for a parent. Is that work somebody owes you back pay for, or not? Just yes or no. I want to see the answers. And if there's someone in your own family right now who's the one who stays, the tired one, the one who's just love being love, send this to them so they know to write it down. Subscribe if you want the next one. There's always a next one, because there's always another clean piece of paper somewhere with a lie living inside it, and another person too tired to fight it, and I'm going to keep telling you how the tired ones win anyway. My mother is by the window. Her tea is hot in the chipped cup with the cornflowers, the one her own mother poured from once. It's on time, and it always will be, for as long as I'm the one who stays. Until next time.